Welcome to the AI Brief from the YPO Technology Network. I'm Stephen Forte. Anthropic held their annual conference last week, and most of the coverage of what they announced reads like a product launch recap. New capabilities, new model, new compute deal, impressive on a slide, also on its own useless to you. The story that matters today is not what Anthropic announced, it is what those announcements make operationally possible inside your company. So we're going to read it that way, not as a press release, as a P&L event. By the end of this episode, you will have a usable picture of what Anthropic actually shipped, a working method for turning that into a real workflow change inside your business, and a concrete walkthrough of how to build one of these things, what you do on Monday morning, what you watch for on Wednesday, and what you change on Friday. It is going to run a little longer than usual because the method is the point. Let's set the table. Quick orientation, because not all of you live on tech Twitter, and there is no reason you should. Anthropic, the AI lab behind Claude, the rival to OpenAI's ChatGPT, used last week's conference to ship enterprise infrastructure rather than another headline model. 4 pieces matter, and they matter together more than they matter apart. The first is managed agents. Think of it as a place to run a long-lived AI worker, one that can pick up a job at 7 a.m., grind through it across many steps and many hours, remember context between sessions, and be supervised the way you would supervise a junior analyst. Until recently, most agents were short chat sessions. They forgot everything between turns. This is the version that can actually run a process, not a conversation, a process. The second is multi-agent orchestration. A lead agent assigns work to specialist sub-agents and assembles the result. One specialist pulls the data, another checks it, a third writes the summary. A fourth handles the exception cases. The lead agent is the manager. The others are the team. It is the org chart applied to software. Why this matters: real workflows are never one prompt long. They are a relay race, and a single agent trying to run the whole race tends to drop the baton. The third is what Anthropic calls outcomes, basically a rubric. You write the standard the work has to meet in plain language. Did it pull all 3 sources? Did the variance threshold get applied correctly? Did the format match the standard? The agent self-checks against that rubric before it hands the work to a human. This shifts the conversation from, did the model sound confident, to did it actually do the job to spec, which is the conversation a CFO has been wanting to have for 2 years. The fourth is a memory feature playfully named dreaming, where the system improves its own recall and judgment between sessions. Less mystical than the name suggests, more like an analyst who finally remembers what you told her last month and stops asking you the same question every quarter. Underneath all of this, Anthropic announced a serious compute expansion, billions in chips and capacity. That part is the boring footnote that turns out to matter most. We will come back to it. Give them credit for the sequencing of these releases. It is rare in this industry to ship the unsexy infrastructure, permissions, audit logs, rubrics, memory at the same pace as the models. Most labs ship the demo and let you sort out the rest. Anthropic is shipping both. I mean that. Here is the part that does not make the press release. The reason most enterprise AI efforts stall is not that the model is not smart enough. It is that the workflow breaks in production. Permissions are messy. Internal APIs are inconsistent. One system is slow. The output format is wrong half the time. And when something goes sideways, nobody can reconstruct what the agent actually did. That is not a model problem. That is a sequencing problem. The companies getting this right are not buying production-grade tools first. They are running the work in a specific order. Most of you, I suspect, are running it backwards, buying the production tool, then trying to reverse engineer the spec from a vendor demo. So here is the order that actually works. 3 stages. The first one is where most of the value is hiding. So stage 1, this is where you stop reading about agents and start building one. The right environment for this is something flexible. Perplexity Computer is the one I use. I am biased. But the principle holds for any tool that lets a senior person wire up an actual end-to-end run without filing an engineering ticket. Here is what stage 1 looks like in practice. Block out half a day, pick the workflow, open the tool, and then walk through these moves roughly in this order. First, you write a draft prompt. It describes the agent's job in plain language, not a spec document, not a system prompt with 1,000 rules. It is a short description of what you would tell a smart new hire on their first day, something like, every morning, pull yesterday's transactions from these three systems, match them against expected payments, flag the mismatches, draft me a one-page summary by 8 a.m. That is the prompt. That is enough to start. Next, you connect the tools, maybe Gmail, maybe Drive, maybe a Notion database, maybe your CRM, maybe a CSV someone drops in a folder. Pick the connectors the workflow actually touches, skip the ones it does not. The temptation is to wire up everything, resist it. You're trying to learn the workflow, not document the company. Then you hit run and you watch. What happens next is rarely what you expected, which is the entire point of stage one. Three patterns show up almost every time. You should be looking for all of them. The first pattern, the order is wrong. You wrote a clean three-step process. Pull the data, classify it, draft the email, the agent runs, and the output is wrong. Not because the model is dumb, because the data was malformed before step two ever started. And the classification really needed to happen first against a smaller, cleaner sample. So you flip the order, what you wrote as step three becomes step one, the next run works. You did not learn that from a whiteboard. You learned it from running it badly. Once, the second pattern, the agent reads the instruction differently than you wrote it. You write the rubric the way a human would describe it. The agent takes you literally in a place you did not mean literally, or it interprets a word the way the dictionary defines it, instead of the way your operations team uses it. You meant open invoices the way finance means it. The agent took it the way a salesperson means it. The output is technically correct and operationally useless. So you rewrite the instruction, not because the agent failed, because the agent thought differently than you thought, and the spec needs to meet it where it actually lives. The third pattern, the QA step belongs somewhere different than you thought. Most people write the QA check at the end, run the whole workflow, then have the agent verify. What you usually find is that QA needs to happen at every stage, not just at the end. Did the connector actually return data, or did it return an empty list and keep going? Did the classification match the format the next step expects? Did the variance check use this month's threshold or last month's? By the end of stage one, you are usually running a small rubric at every step, not one big rubric at the end. That is a structural change, not a wording change. And you only find it by running the thing. So the work of stage one is not building the final system. It is building the spec for the final system by running it badly several times in a flexible environment and watching the seams. You are testing whether each connector returns what you think it returns. You are testing whether the QA belongs at the end, the middle, or built into every step. You are testing whether two of the steps should actually be one, or whether one step should actually be three. This stage is anthropology, not engineering. You are watching how the work moves and where it stalls. If you skip it, and most companies do, you end up automating the whiteboard version of the workflow and wondering why nothing got faster. A reasonable budget for stage one on a contained workflow is one senior person. Half a day to start, then a couple of hours a day for a week. If you are still in stage one after 3 weeks, you picked a workflow that was too big. Cut it in half and start over. Once the rough version actually works end to end, you run it daily for 10 to 15 business days, manually or semi-manually, with a senior person in the loop on every output. You're validating three things, but they are not three things on a slide. They are three things you only see by living with the output. Whether the deliverable is genuinely useful to the person who has to consume it, not pretty, useful. Whether the exception cases that always exist are actually being caught or quietly slipping through, and whether the summary at the end is something a real human would forward or quietly delete. This is where most pilots die quietly, not because the model failed, because finance looked at the output and said, this is not what we asked for. The team built the demo. They did not build the deliverable. 2 weeks of real operation surfaces that gap before you spend 6 figures wiring it into permanent infrastructure. Stage two also does something the demo cannot. It sharpens the rubric. By the end of the 2 weeks, you know which checks the agent has to run before it hands the work to a human, and which exceptions are rare enough to just escalate every time. You know which days have edge cases, the close week, the holiday week, the system maintenance day, and how the agent should handle them differently. You know which connector flakes out on Tuesdays for reasons nobody can explain. That sharpened rubric, that operating manual you only get by living with the thing, becomes the input to stage 3. One useful discipline during stage 2 is a daily 2-line journal entry. What did the agent get right today? What did it get wrong and why? That journal is the artifact you hand to whoever builds the production version. It is worth more than any spec document a consultant will write you. Before we get to stage 3, the question I get most often: how do you actually move from one tool to the other without losing what you learned? The answer is unglamorous, and it works. Throughout stage 1 and stage 2, you have Perplexity Computer write everything down as markdown documents, living in a folder, not as an afterthought, as part of the work. Every time you flip the order of a step, the markdown gets updated. Every time you sharpen the rubric, the markdown gets updated. Every exception you catch in stage 2, every vendor quirk, every connector that flakes on Tuesdays, it all goes into the markdown. By the end of stage 2, you have a small folder of markdown files, the agent's instruction prompt, the connector list with what each one returns and how, the per-step rubric, the exception handling rules, the 2-line journal from every day of stage 2, the named scenarios that broke the early versions. That folder is the spec. It is not a deck. It is not a Word document. It is not a vendor diagram. It is the operating manual that the system itself wrote by being run. When you move to stage 3, that markdown folder is the seed. You hand it to managed agents, or whatever production environment you're using, and the receiving model reads it as its starting context. There is some tweaking. Different models read instructions slightly differently. A phrase that worked perfectly in Perplexity Computer might need a small rewrite for Claude in managed agents. Maybe you split one long markdown file into 3 shorter ones the lead agent and sub-agents each pick up. Maybe you tighten a rubric line that was too loose, light tweaks, not a rewrite. That is the handoff. There is no mystery in it. Markdown is the format both ends speak. You learned the workflow in one tool. You wrote it down as you learned. You hand the writing to the next tool. The next tool runs it for real. No blank page, no vendor onboarding, no 2-month implementation project. Now, and only now, the hardened version moves into something built for production. This is where Anthropic's managed agents become genuinely interesting. Long-running sessions, so the work survives a restart. Scoped permissions, so the agent can touch what it needs and nothing it does not. Multi-agent coordination, so the specialists from your stage 2 journal each get their own lane. Persistent memory, so the institutional knowledge from those 2 weeks of journaling is the agent's starting point. The rubric you sharpened becomes the outcomes spec the agent self-checks against. And the audit trail makes the whole thing legible to whoever is going to ask the legible thing questions. The shorthand worth holding on to is this: use Perplexity Computer, or a tool like it, to learn the workflow. Use Anthropic Managed Agents, or one like it, to run the workflow. 2 different tools, 2 different jobs. Discover, then operate. Skip stage 1 and you ship a demo. Skip stage 2 and you ship a liability. Run all 3 and you ship something the CFO will defend in the budget cycle. Quick footnote that matters more than it sounds: the hidden blocker on enterprise AI over the last year has not been intelligence. It has been compute. Chip shortages, usage caps throttling during peak hours, degraded behavior when you needed it most. The threshold question for the enterprise was never whether the model is brilliant in a demo. It was whether the model can run inside a real workflow every single day without becoming the bottleneck itself. Anthropic's compute expansion is the part that turns a fragile experiment into something a CFO will fund. Brilliance gets you a pilot. Reliability gets you a budget line. Those are different things. My read on the moment we are in is fairly simple. Most companies do not have an AI strategy problem. They have a sequencing problem. They are buying production tools before they have built the spec, and they are writing the spec from a whiteboard instead of from a working draft. The fix is unromantic. Pick one workflow this quarter, not 5, not a portfolio, 1. Pick the one where you already know the bulk of the effort is reformatting rather than judgment. Reconciliation, expense triage, sales order processing, customer onboarding, ticket routing, they all qualify. Build the bad version in a flexible environment over a week. Run it for real for 2 weeks. Then, and only then, harden the version that actually worked into a managed environment built to run it every day. 90 days, end to end. One workflow demonstrably cheaper, faster, or more accurate than it was the quarter before. That is the unlock. The companies that do that this year will be in a different operating posture by next year. The companies that keep bolting chatbots onto existing software will be running the same business with a slightly newer skin on it. The compute will commoditize, the model rankings will keep flipping, the press releases will keep coming. And most of them will read like product launches because most of them are. Your job is not to read the announcement. Your job is to look at the announcement and ask the only question that matters. What does this make possible inside the building that was not possible last quarter? And which of those possibilities is worth 90 days of disciplined attention? Pick the one, build the bad version, live with it for 2 weeks, then ship it. That is the YPO Tech Network AI brief for Monday, May 11th. I am Stephen Forte. If this was useful, send it to a fellow member. I will be back tomorrow with more. Until then, stay sharp.